The bass from the music upstairs pounded through the floorboards, each beat reverberating through my skull as I sat on the cold concrete floor of my own basement, my wrists raw from pounding on the locked door for the past 3 hours. The party I had explicitly told my sister-in-law Marina not to throw in my house while I was supposed to be at a medical conference was in full swing above me, and here I was, trapped like some unwanted pest they'd decided to store away until convenient. My phone light illuminated the champagne bottle they'd mockingly left beside me, as if locking me in my own basement was some kind of twisted joke worthy of celebration. But they had no idea that my neighbor Caroline had already seen them force me down here through her kitchen window, or that she'd immediately called both the police and my lawyer, Richard Blackstone, who happened to be her brother and had been waiting years for enough evidence to help me escape this toxic situation I'd been too proud and too foolish to acknowledge. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Victoria Chun, and at 47 I should have known better than to marry into the Rosenberg family, but love has a way of making intelligent women do remarkably stupid things. When I met Daniel Rosenberg 8 years ago at a charity fundraiser for the hospital where I worked as a pediatric surgeon, he seemed like everything my first marriage hadn't been. Where Marcus had been cold and calculating, Daniel was warm and spontaneous. Where Marcus had isolated me from friends and family, Daniel came with a large, boisterous family who seemed to embrace me immediately. His mother, Sylvia, had pulled me aside at our engagement party, tears in her eyes, telling me I was the daughter she'd always wanted. His sister Marina had insisted on planning my bachelorette party, calling me her new best friend. His brother Joel had offered to help me move my things into Daniel's sprawling estate in Westchester, joking that I was upgrading the family gene pool with my medical degree and accomplished background. The red flags had been there from the beginning, small tears in the perfect family portrait they presented. Marina's habit of borrowing my jewelry and returning it damaged or not at all, always with a laughing excuse about her scattered brain. Joel's uncomfortable comments about my income, always framed as jokes about sugar mamas and kept women, despite the fact that Daniel earned well as a commercial real estate developer. Sylvia's gradual shift from loving mother-in-law to critical observer, finding fault with my cooking, my decorating choices, my work schedule that kept me away from family gatherings. But I had dismissed each incident, convinced myself I was being too sensitive, too quick to judge after my difficult first marriage had left me wary of family dynamics. Daniel had been my anchor through it all, always quick to smooth things over, to explain away his family's behavior with practiced ease. Marina was just enthusiastic and didn't always think things through. Joel's humor could be crude, but he meant no harm. His mother was particular about things, but it came from a place of love, wanting everything to be perfect for the family. I had wanted so desperately to believe him, to have the family I'd never had growing up as an only child with parents who died young, leaving me to navigate adulthood essentially alone except for a few close friends I'd maintained since medical school. The transformation had been gradual after our wedding, so slow that I hadn't noticed the cage being built around me until I was firmly locked inside. Family dinners became command performances where missing one due to surgery or patient emergencies resulted in weeks of cold shoulders and passive-aggressive comments. My contributions were never quite good enough, my expensive gifts dismissed while Marina's dollar store decorations were praised as thoughtful. They began showing up at the house unannounced, using the spare keys I'd naively distributed because family should always feel welcome. My home office became Joel's temporary workspace when he was between jobs, which seemed to be constantly. Marina's kids treated my carefully decorated living room like a playground while she scrolled through her phone, occasionally looking up to tell me I was too uptight when I suggested they be careful with my grandmother's china. The incident that had started everything, that had led to me being locked in my own basement like some Victorian madwoman, had occurred 3 weeks ago when I'd finally reached my limit. I had come home from a particularly difficult surgery, a 6-year-old with a tumor that had been more complex than the scans had indicated, to find Marina hosting a jewelry party in my living room with 20 of her friends. My dining room table was covered in cheap cosmetics and costume jewelry, wine stains already setting into my Persian rug, and someone had broken the antique mirror in the hallway, leaving the shards swept into a corner but not cleaned up. When I'd asked them to leave, Marina had laughed, that tinkling false laugh she used when she was about to be particularly cruel, and informed me that Daniel had said it was fine, that I needed to loosen up and stop being so controlling. The fight that followed with Daniel that night had been explosive. For the first time in our marriage, I had laid out every single incident, every boundary crossed, every valuable item destroyed or stolen, every moment of disrespect I had swallowed in the name of keeping peace. His response had been to call me paranoid, to suggest that maybe the stress of my job was making me imagine slights where none existed, that his family had embraced me and I was throwing their love back in their faces. When I'd stood my ground, something had shifted in his expression, a coldness I'd never seen before settling over his features as he'd said the words that had changed everything between us. You need to remember, Victoria, that this is my family's house. The deed might have both our names on it, but the down payment came from my mother. You're living here because we allow it. The truth of our financial arrangement had never been discussed so bluntly before. Yes, Sylvia had provided the down payment as a wedding gift, but I had paid for all the renovations, the furniture, the monthly mortgage payments, the utilities, everything that had transformed the outdated colonial into a showcase home. I had documentation for every penny spent, every receipt saved in my compulsively organized files. But in that moment, I'd realized that possession and ownership were two very different things in the Rosenberg family dynamics, and I had been categorized as a possession the moment I'd said yes to Daniel's proposal. I had made my plans carefully after that night, consulting with Richard Blackstone on Caroline's recommendation. She had noticed the changes in me over the years, the way I'd gradually stopped hosting dinner parties, stopped talking about my work, stopped being the confident surgeon she'd met when I'd first moved in next door. Richard had been horrified but not surprised by what I'd told him, apparently having dealt with several cases of financial and emotional abuse among the wealthy families of Westchester County. He'd advised me to document everything, to start separating my finances carefully, to make plans for a clean exit. That the medical conference in Boston this weekend had been legitimate, a presentation on new techniques in pediatric tumor removal that I'd been invited to give based on my research. I had left Friday morning, checking into the hotel as planned, attending the opening sessions, making sure my presence was documented. But a severe migraine, the kind I'd been getting more frequently since the stress of my marriage had intensified, had forced me to leave early. I'd driven home in the late afternoon, expecting to find the house empty since Daniel had mentioned having dinner plans with clients in the city. Instead, I'd walked into a full-scale party in progress, at least 50 people throughout the first floor of my house, the furniture pushed aside for dancing, professional bartenders serving drinks in my crystal glassware, and Marina holding court in my living room like she owned the place. The shock on her face when she'd seen me in the doorway had quickly transformed into something else, a calculating look that should have warned me to leave immediately. But this was my house, regardless of whose name had originally been on the down payment, and I'd stood my ground, demanding that everyone leave immediately. Marina had approached me with that same false smile, suggesting we talk privately about this, that there was no need to make a scene in front of her guests. Like a fool, I'd agreed, following her toward what I thought would be the kitchen for a conversation. Instead, she'd opened the basement door, and as I turned to ask what she was doing, Joel had appeared behind me, giving me a sharp push that sent me stumbling down the stairs. I'd caught myself on the railing, turning back in shock to see them both standing at the top of the stairs, and then the door had slammed shut, the lock clicking with a finality that had sent ice through my veins. The first hour had been spent in disbelief, certain this was some kind of sick joke that would end with them opening the door and laughing at how gullible I'd been to fall for it. I'd pounded on the door, shouted myself hoarse, tried to rationalize with them through the thick wood. The only response had been the music being turned up louder, drowning out my voice. My phone had service, but when I tried to call Daniel, it had gone straight to voicemail. The police non-emergency line had put me on hold, and I'd hung up in frustration, certain I could handle this myself. It wasn't until I'd noticed the champagne bottle, left deliberately on the workbench with a mocking note that said, "Enjoy your time out, princess," that the full reality of my situation had sunk in. The basement wasn't unfinished, thankfully. Daniel had renovated it into a workshop and storage area, with small windows near the ceiling that looked out at ground level. But those windows were sealed shut and made of thick block glass that distorted everything beyond them. The door was solid wood with a deadbolt that could only be opened from the outside, a security feature Daniel had insisted on to protect his tools and equipment. There was a utility sink in a bathroom, but no other way out unless I wanted to try breaking through the glass blocks, which would require tools I didn't have access to since Daniel kept his equipment locked in cabinets I'd never bothered to learn the combinations for. As I sat there in the growing darkness, the party raging above me, I thought about all the moments that had led to this point. Every capitulation, every time I'd chosen peace over principle, every boundary I'd allowed them to cross in the name of family harmony. I had been like the proverbial frog in slowly boiling water, not realizing the danger until I was already cooked. But what Marina and Joel didn't know, what even Daniel didn't know, was that I had been documenting everything for months now on Richard's advice. Every receipt for items they damaged, every text message demanding money or favors, every recording from the security cameras I'd had installed in the common areas of the house under the guise of general safety. The sound of sirens in the distance cut through my self-recrimination, growing louder as they approached.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The music upstairs continued to pound, but I could hear something else now, voices raised in alarm, the sound of feet moving quickly across the floor above me. The sirens were definitely getting closer, and then they stopped, presumably in front of the house. The music cut off abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. I stood up, moving closer to the door, straining to hear what was happening above. Footsteps on the stairs, heavy and measured, not the quick patter of Marina's heels or Joel's casual shuffle. Then a voice, deep and authoritative, called out, "Mrs. Chun? Victoria Chun? This is Officer Martinez with the Westchester Police Department. Are you down there?" Relief flooded through me so intensely that my knees nearly buckled as I called back with a voice hoarse from shouting, "Yes, I'm here. The door is locked from the outside. I can't get out." There was a brief consultation above, multiple voices discussing something I couldn't quite make out, and then the sound of the lock turning. The door opened and I blinked in the sudden brightness of the kitchen lights, seeing not just Officer Martinez but 3 other police officers, and behind them, Richard Blackstone in his characteristic navy suit despite it being a Saturday evening. His expression was professionally neutral, but I could see the anger burning in his eyes as he took in my disheveled appearance, the evidence of my imprisonment. Marina's voice rose shrilly from somewhere beyond the kitchen, insisting this was all a misunderstanding, that I had asked to be left alone in the basement, that I was mentally unstable and making things up for attention. Joel was trying a different tactic, his voice jovial as he attempted to convince another officer that this was just a family joke that had gone too far, nothing worth involving the authorities over. But their guests were already leaving in droves, the party atmosphere completely shattered by the arrival of law enforcement. Officer Martinez, a woman who looked to be in her 40s with kind eyes but a no-nonsense demeanor, gently guided me up the stairs while asking if I needed medical attention. I declined, though my wrists were scraped from pounding on the door and my throat was raw. Richard stayed close, his presence a comforting reminder that I wasn't alone in this anymore. As we emerged into the kitchen, I saw the full extent of the party damage. My carefully organized space was chaos, bottles and glasses everywhere, food ground into my hardwood floors, and was that a burn mark on my granite countertop? Daniel stood near the kitchen island, his face a mask of barely controlled fury, though I couldn't tell if it was directed at his siblings for their actions or at me for involving the police. Sylvia had apparently been summoned from wherever she'd been spending her evening, her usually perfect appearance slightly mussed as she clutched her pearls, literally, while speaking in urgent whispers to Marina. The scene was almost comedic in its predictability, the Rosenberg family circling the wagons against the outside threat, which in this case happened to be the law and their own family member who had finally had enough. "Mrs. Chun," Officer Martinez addressed me formally, "we need to take your statement about what happened here tonight. But first, I want to confirm that you are the legal resident of this property?" I nodded, my voice steadier now as I replied that yes, my name was on the deed, this was my legal residence, and I had not given permission for this party or for being locked in my basement. Richard stepped forward then, producing a folder from his briefcase that contained copies of the deed, the mortgage statement showing my payments, and most damningly, a thumb drive he handed to Officer Martinez. "This contains security footage from Mrs. Chen's home security system," he explained calmly, though I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. I believe you'll find it clearly shows Mrs. Chun being physically forced into the basement and locked inside against her will. False imprisonment is a felony in New York State, as I'm sure you're aware. The color drained from Marina's face as she realized there was video evidence of their actions. Joel started to speak, likely to spin some story about misunderstanding the situation, but another officer informed him that he'd need to come to the station to give a formal statement. The party guests who hadn't already fled were being interviewed by the remaining officers, their contact information recorded, their slightly intoxicated statements painting a picture of Marina and Joel bragging about teaching the uptight lady of the house a lesson. Daniel finally found his voice, stepping toward me with his hands outstretched in a placating gesture I'd seen too many times before. Victoria, sweetheart, this is all a terrible misunderstanding. You know how Marina and Joel can be after a few drinks. They didn't mean any harm. We can sort this out as a family. There's no need for all this drama. The audacity of his statement, calling my false imprisonment drama, crystallized something in me that had been forming since the moment that basement door had locked behind me. I looked at this man I had once loved, had built a life with, had trusted with my heart and my home, and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a cool clarity that what I was looking at was not a partner, but an enabler who had allowed his family to slowly destroy my sense of self while he stood by and made excuses. Daniel, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the kitchen, causing everyone to pause and listen. Your sister and brother locked me in a basement for 3 hours while they threw a party in my home without my permission. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a crime. And we will not be sorting this out as a family because as of this moment, I am no longer part of your family. Sylvia gasped dramatically, clutching at her chest as though I'd physically struck her, beginning a tirade about ungrateful wives and the sanctity of marriage, but Officer Martinez cut her off with a look that could have frozen fire. The officer informed Marina and Joel that they would need to come to the station immediately, and while they weren't under arrest yet, that could change depending on what the investigation revealed. Richard added that he would be filing for an emergency order of protection on my behalf, ensuring that none of them could come near me or the property while the legal proceedings were ongoing. The next hour was a blur of statements and procedures, the police methodically documenting everything from the damage to the house to my physical condition. Photographs were taken of my scraped wrists, the basement where I'd been confined, the mocking champagne bottle with its note. Marina and Joel were eventually escorted to police vehicles, both suddenly silent after their lawyers had apparently advised them via phone to say nothing further. Daniel tried several more times to speak with me, but Richard ran interference each time, reminding him that any communication should go through attorneys from this point forward. As the house finally emptied of police and unwanted family members, leaving just Caroline, Richard, and myself, I stood in my destroyed living room and felt an unexpected sense of lightness. Yes, my home was a disaster. Yes, I was facing what would undoubtedly be an ugly divorce and legal battle. But for the first time in 8 years, I could breathe freely in my own space without worrying about who might show up uninvited, or what new boundary would be crossed in the name of family togetherness. Caroline, bless her, had already started making tea in my kitchen, carefully navigating around the party debris with the practiced efficiency of someone who had raised 4 children and seen worse messes. She brought me a cup of chamomile, the warmth of it soothing my raw throat as she sat beside me on the couch, her presence a comfort that required no words. Richard was on his phone, making arrangements with a cleaning service to come first thing in the morning, already thinking 3 steps ahead as any good lawyer would. I should have done this years ago, I said quietly, more to myself than to them, but Caroline reached over and squeezed my hand gently. You did it when you were ready, she replied simply. That's all that matters now. Richard ended his call and turned to face me, his expression serious but not unkind as he laid out what would happen next. Marina and Joel would likely be charged with false imprisonment at minimum, potentially more depending on what the investigation revealed. The order of protection would be in place by Monday morning, preventing any of the Rosenbergs from coming within 100 feet of me or attempting to contact me. The divorce papers he'd had drawn up weeks ago at my request but hadn't filed yet would be submitted first thing Monday as well. My assets were already protected thanks to the documentation we'd been gathering, and the prenuptial agreement Daniel had insisted on to protect his family's wealth would actually work in my favor now, clearly delineating what was his and what was mine. The irony wasn't lost on me that Daniel's own paranoia about protecting his assets had given me the cleanest path to freedom. The house would be a battle, given Sylvia's down payment, but Richard was confident that my documentation of payments and improvements, combined with the criminal charges against Daniel's family members, would give me significant leverage in negotiations. He mentioned something about implied consent and hostile environment, legal terms that floated over my exhausted mind but seemed to give him satisfaction. As the evening wore on and the adrenaline began to fade, the full emotional impact of what had happened started to sink in. I had been locked in a basement in my own home by people who were supposed to be family. The violation of it, the casual cruelty, the assumption that they could do whatever they wanted because I had no recourse, it was almost too much to process. But underneath the hurt and anger, there was something else growing. A seeds of recognition that I was stronger than I'd given myself credit for. I had survived Marcus and his cold manipulation. I had survived the Rosenbergs and their suffocating dysfunction. I would survive this too and come out the other side free to build the life I actually wanted, not the one others had decided I should have. The sound of my phone buzzing broke through my reflection. A text from Daniel, despite Richard's warnings not to contact me. This is all a misunderstanding. Please don't let outsiders tear our family apart. We can work through this together. I showed it to Richard, who immediately documented it as a violation of the implied no-contact understanding, then blocked Daniel's number. There would be no more working through things together. That option had ended the moment his siblings had turned that lock, and he needed to understand that actions, especially criminal ones, had consequences that couldn't be smoothed over with platitudes about family. As midnight approached, Caroline finally convinced me to pack a bag and come stay with her for a few days until the house could be cleaned and the locks changed. Richard agreed this was wise, adding that he'd arrange for a security company to do a full sweep and upgrade of the system, ensuring that no one with a spare key could ever gain unauthorized access again. The thought of leaving my home, even temporarily, bothered me until I realized it wasn't really my home anymore. Not with the phantom presence of the Rosenbergs in every room, their entitlement soaked into the very walls. I stood in my bedroom, packing carefully chosen items into a suitcase, when I noticed that several pieces of jewelry were missing from my dresser. Marina, of course. Even while planning to lock me in the basement, she hadn't been able to resist helping herself to my belongings one more time. I documented the missing items with photos of the empty spaces, adding them to the growing list of thefts that Richard would include in his filings. Each violation, no matter how small, would be accounted for. There would be no more letting things slide, no more choosing peace over justice. The drive to Caroline's house was short, but felt like crossing into a different world. Her home was warm and lived in, with photos of her children and grandchildren covering every surface, the comfortable chaos of a life fully lived. She showed me to her guest room, which her daughter had recently vacated after graduating from college, and I was touched to see she'd already placed fresh flowers on the nightstand, a small gesture of welcome that brought tears to my eyes for the first time that evening. "Tomorrow will be better," she said simply, giving me a brief hug before leaving me to rest. But I couldn't sleep, not yet. Instead, I sat by the window looking out at the familiar neighborhood from this new perspective, and began to write. Not the clinical notes I was used to creating for patient files, but a personal account of everything that had happened, everything that had led to this point. Richard had said documentation was important, but this was different. This was, for me, a way to process the trauma and begin to reclaim my narrative from those who had tried to rewrite it for their own purposes. As dawn broke over Westchester County, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I finally closed my notebook and prepared for sleep. In a few hours, the legal machinery would begin turning in earnest. Marina and Joel would face formal charges. Daniel would be served with divorce papers. The Rosenberg family would learn that their actions had consequences they couldn't buy or manipulate their way out of. But for now, in this moment of quiet transition, I allowed myself to feel the first stirrings of something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope for a future that was entirely my own. The Monday morning following my imprisonment brought an avalanche of legal proceedings that Richard orchestrated with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony. I sat in his office, a space that breathed old money and established power with its mahogany furniture and leather-bound legal volumes, watching him deploy a team of associates like chess pieces across a board. Each one had a specific role: documenting damages, filing motions, preparing briefs that would make the Rosenberg family understand that their reign of casual cruelty had come to an abrupt end. The emergency order of protection had been granted at 7 that morning, before the Rosenbergs had probably even finished their morning coffee. Richard had personally overseen its delivery to Daniel at his office, along with the divorce papers and a detailed inventory of missing items from the house. The security footage from Saturday night had been edited into a compelling narrative that showed not just my imprisonment, but the systematic destruction of my property, Marina helping herself to my jewelry even as her guests destroyed my living room, Joel pouring expensive whiskey from my private collection while laughing about teaching the Ice Queen a lesson. What I hadn't expected was the media attention. Someone at the party, perhaps one of Marina's society friends with a taste for gossip, had leaked the story to a local news blog. Prominent surgeon locked in basement during illegal house party ran across the digital headlines, accompanied by a photo of police cars outside my house that someone had snapped with their phone. My phone hadn't stopped ringing since, colleagues expressing shock and support, patients' families reaching out with concern, and journalists wanting exclusive interviews about what they were calling the most outrageous case of domestic imprisonment in Westchester County history. Richard advised me to stay silent for now, to let the legal process unfold without giving the Rosenbergs ammunition to claim I was trying to destroy their reputations out of spite. But their reputations were doing a fine job of destroying themselves. Marina's booking photo had somehow made its way onto social media. Her perfectly contoured makeup smeared, her expression a mixture of indignation and fear that had become an instant meme among the younger crowd, who knew her from her failed lifestyle blogging attempts. Joel's employer, a financial firm that prided itself on conservative values and spotless reputations, had placed him on immediate administrative leave pending the outcome of the criminal charges. Daniel, however, was fighting back with the resources I'd always known he had but had never seen deployed against me. By Tuesday afternoon he'd assembled his own legal team, headed by Gregory Ashford, a man known for turning perpetrators into victims with a silver tongue and a complete absence of moral boundaries. The narrative they were constructing was predictable but potentially effective. I was a mentally unstable woman, driven to paranoia by the stress of my work, who had misinterpreted a harmless family prank and blown it out of proportion to gain advantage in an already planned divorce. They had their own evidence, carefully curated text messages where I'd express frustration with work, photos from family events where I stood apart from the group looking uncomfortable which they claimed showed my antisocial tendencies, even testimony from Sylvia's therapist, whom I'd seen twice at her insistence years ago, suggesting I had difficulty with family bonding. Of course, they conveniently left out the context that the therapist had actually suggested the family dynamics were toxic and recommended I set firmer boundaries, advice I'd foolishly ignored at the time. Richard wasn't concerned, though his assistant, Jennifer, had compiled a file that made their claims look like the desperate fabrications they were. Screenshots of Marina's Instagram posts from that night, posted while I was locked in the basement, bragging about throwing the party of the year at her sister-in-law's house with champagne glass emojis and laughing faces. Joel's text messages to his friends, obtained through a subpoena, explicitly discussing their plan to teach me a lesson by locking me up until I learned my place. Most damning of all was a voicemail Sylvia had left for her sister that Caroline's lawyer brother had somehow legally obtained, where she called me a gold-digging bitch who needed to be put in her place before she got any ideas about her position in the family. The civil suit Richard filed on my behalf sought damages that made even my surgeon's salary seem modest. False imprisonment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, destruction of property, theft, and conspiracy to commit fraud regarding the house ownership. The number he'd arrived at, $3.7 million, was precisely calculated to include not just actual damages, but punitive ones designed to ensure the Rosenbergs never forgot the cost of their actions. When I'd balked at the amount, worried it seemed vindictive, Richard had fixed me with a steady gaze and reminded me that vindication and vindictiveness were different things, and I was entitled to the former after years of the latter being directed at me. By Wednesday, the criminal case had gained momentum. The district attorney, a woman named Patricia Hernandez who had zero tolerance for wealthy families who thought they were above the law, had personally taken over the case. Marina and Joel were facing not just false imprisonment charges, but also criminal trespass, theft, and conspiracy charges that could result in significant jail time. Their lawyers were already floating plea deals, but Patricia wasn't interested in anything that didn't include actual incarceration, Not just community service at some comfortable charity where they'd spend their time planning their next society event. The house had been professionally cleaned and the locks changed, but I couldn't bring myself to return yet. Every time I thought about walking through those doors, I imagined seeing Marina in my living room, Joel at my kitchen counter, their presence lingering like a poisonous fog. Caroline had extended her hospitality indefinitely, even suggesting I could stay until the divorce was finalized if needed. But I knew I had to face the space eventually, had to reclaim it from the ghosts of violations past. It was Thursday when I finally returned, accompanied by Richard and a security consultant he'd hired to upgrade the entire system. Walking through the front door felt like entering a crime scene, which in a way it was. The cleaning service had done an excellent job, everything spotless and arranged exactly as it had been before, but I could still see the phantom damage, still hear the echo of that party raging above while I sat trapped below. The security consultant, a former military man named James who spoke in clipped, efficient sentences, walked me through the new measures. Biometric locks that only I could open, cameras with facial recognition that would alert me to any unwanted visitors before they even reached the porch, panic buttons discreetly placed throughout the house that would immediately summon both private security and law enforcement. It seemed like overkill, but after what had happened, I wanted fortress-level protection from any future violations. As we stood in the basement, James examining the door that had been my prison, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered, immediately recognizing Sylvia's carefully modulated voice, though she was calling from someone else's phone to circumvent the protection order. "Victoria, darling," she began, her tone dripping with false sweetness that made my skin crawl. "Surely we can resolve this unpleasantness without destroying the entire family. Marina and Joel made a mistake, but sending them to prison? That's excessive, don't you think?" Richard immediately began recording the conversation on his phone, nodding for me to continue as I put mine on speaker. I let her talk, let her dig her own grave with each word as she alternated between threats about how they'd destroy me in court and promises of financial compensation if I dropped the charges. When she finally paused for breath, I spoke for the first time. "Sylvia, you're violating a protection order by contacting me. This conversation is being recorded and will be provided to the district attorney. But since you've chosen to reach out, let me be perfectly clear. Your children committed crimes against me. They will face the consequences of those crimes. There will be no negotiation, no settlement that doesn't include full accountability for their actions. And if you contact me again, you'll be facing charges yourself." The silence on the other end was deafening before she snarled that I'd regret this, that I had no idea who I was dealing with, that the Rosenberg family had resources I couldn't imagine. Then the line went dead, and Richard was already on the phone with Patricia Hernandez, reporting the violation and emailing the recording. By that evening, Sylvia had been formally warned that any further contact would result in her own arrest, a development that sent shockwaves through their social circle. Friday brought an unexpected visitor to Caroline's house where I was still staying. Daniel's mother's sister, Aunt Rebecca, a woman I'd only met a handful of times at family gatherings where she'd seemed to observe everything while saying little. She stood on Caroline's porch, hands folded primly in front of her, asking if she could speak with me for just a few minutes. Richard had advised me not to speak to any Rosenberg family members, but Rebecca had always been different, maintaining a careful distance from the family dynamics that I now understood was deliberate self-preservation. We sat in Caroline's garden, the spring flowers blooming around us in cheerful defiance of the darkness that had brought us together. Rebecca looked older than her 70 years, worn down by decades of watching her family's dysfunction from the sidelines, unable or unwilling to intervene. "I owe you an apology," she began without preamble, her voice steady but tinged with regret. "I saw what they were doing to you, the same thing they did to Daniel's first wife, the same thing they've done to anyone who married into this family who wasn't willing to be absorbed completely into their dysfunction. I should have warned you, but I told myself it wasn't my place." The mention of Daniel's first wife, Catherine, stopped me cold. I'd been told she'd left him because she couldn't handle the pressure of his success, that she'd been weak and unsuitable for the lifestyle. Now I wondered what the real story was, what imprisonment she'd faced before finding her escape. Rebecca continued, pulling a worn envelope from her purse and placing it on the table between us. "Catherine left this with me before she disappeared. told me to give it to the next woman who found herself trapped in the Rosenberg web. I held on to it for 12 years, hoping I'd never need to use it. I'm sorry I waited until now. Inside the envelope was a handwritten letter from Catherine, dated 6 months before her divorce from Daniel. As I read her words, I felt a chill despite the warm afternoon sun. She described incidents eerily similar to what I'd experienced, the gradual escalation of control, the destruction of her belongings dismissed as accidents, the gaslighting that made her question her own perceptions. But there was more: incidents that had been covered up, police reports that had mysteriously disappeared, a pattern of abuse that the family money had successfully hidden. The most shocking revelation was about Marina and Joel's role in Catherine's breakdown. They had systematically terrorized her when Daniel wasn't around, hiding her medication, moving her belongings, even staging elaborate pranks that left her questioning her sanity. When she'd finally tried to document everything, they destroyed her evidence and convinced Daniel she was having paranoid delusions. Her escape had been narrow, accepting a minimal divorce settlement just to get away with her sanity intact. "She's a psychiatrist now," Rebecca said quietly as I finished reading. "Lives in California under her maiden name. Rebuilt her entire life from scratch. She wanted you to know that survival is possible, that there's life after the Rosenbergs." I held the letter like it was a lifeline. This proof that I wasn't crazy, that the patterns I'd seen were real and had been repeated before. Rebecca gave me Catherine's contact information, written on a small card, suggesting I might benefit from talking to someone who truly understood what I'd been through. Then she stood to leave, pausing at the garden gate to deliver one final warning. "They won't stop, Victoria. Even with the legal consequences, even with the public humiliation, they won't stop trying to break you because your defiance challenges their entire worldview. Sylvia has spent 40 years creating a family that exists to serve her narcissism, and anyone who threatens that structure becomes an enemy to be destroyed. Be very careful." That evening, Richard called with an update that both thrilled and concerned me. The district attorney had uncovered a pattern of similar incidents involving the Rosenbergs, complaints that had been filed and mysteriously withdrawn, police reports that had been buried, a conspiracy of silence maintained through intimidation and payoffs. Patricia Hernandez was considering expanding the investigation, potentially bringing RICO charges that would treat the family's activities as organized crime. The implications were staggering. We weren't just talking about Marina and Joel facing jail time for what they'd done to me, but potentially the entire family facing federal investigation for years of coordinated criminal behavior. Daniel's real estate business would be scrutinized, Sylvia's charitable foundations examined for money laundering, every financial transaction and personal relationship subject to legal review. But with greater stakes came greater danger. That night, Caroline's security system detected someone attempting to access her property around 2 in the morning. The cameras showed a figure in dark clothing testing windows and doors before the alarm scared them away. The police found no evidence of who it had been, but the message was clear that I wasn't safe even in my friend's home. Richard immediately arranged for professional security, 2 former police officers who would work in shifts to ensure I was never alone. It seemed like something out of a movie, having bodyguards, but the reality of my situation had moved far beyond what I could have imagined when I'd first married into the Rosenberg family. The fairy tale had become a nightmare, and now it was becoming a thriller where my safety was genuinely in question. Saturday brought another twist when Marina's husband, Christopher, reached out through Richard to request a meeting. I'd always thought Christopher was as complicit as the rest of them, but his message suggested otherwise. Against Richard's advice but with security present, I agreed to meet him at a public restaurant, curious about what he could possibly have to say. Christopher looked haggard, his usually perfect appearance disheveled, his eyes haunted by something that might have been conscience finally awakening after years of dormancy. He didn't try to shake my hand or offer false pleasantries, just sat down across from me and began to speak in a voice rough with exhaustion. "I'm leaving Marina," he said without preamble. "Already filed the papers. What she did to you was the final straw, but I should have left years ago when I first saw what she was capable of." He went on to describe a marriage that was even more toxic than what I'd observed from the outside. Marina's cruelty wasn't reserved just for in-laws but extended to anyone she perceived as weak or vulnerable. He'd watched her destroy friendships, sabotage colleagues, even torment their own children when they didn't perform to her standards. He'd been complicit through his silence, he admitted, but he couldn't be anymore. More importantly, he had evidence. Years of recordings he'd made for his own protection, documenting Marina's schemes and the family's coordination in their various cruelties. He offered to turn everything over to the district attorney in exchange for immunity from any charges related to his knowledge of their crimes. It was a desperate move from a desperate man, but it could be the key to ensuring real consequences for the Rosenberg family's years of abuse. Why now? I asked, genuinely curious about what had finally pushed him to action. Christopher's laugh was bitter, devoid of any humor. Because when I saw you in that basement on the security footage, I saw myself. I've been locked in a prison of their making for 15 years, too afraid to leave because of what they might do. But watching you fight back, seeing you refuse to accept it anymore, it made me realize that fear of what they might do is nothing compared to the certainty of what they will do if I stay. The irony wasn't lost on me that my imprisonment had become the key to multiple liberations. Christopher's evidence, combined with Catherine's documentation that Rebecca had also preserved, created a pattern that even the best lawyers would struggle to defend against. The Rosenberg Empire, built on manipulation and maintained through fear, was beginning to crumble from within. Sunday was supposed to be a day of rest, but there was no rest in the war I'd found myself fighting. Daniel had apparently decided that if legal channels weren't working, he'd try emotional manipulation. He showed up at the hospital where I worked, knowing I'd gone in to check on a patient despite being on leave. Security stopped him at the entrance, but not before he'd made enough of a scene that several of my colleagues witnessed him shouting about his rights as a husband, demanding to see his wife, playing the victim of a vindictive woman trying to destroy his family. The performance might have worked if one of the nurses hadn't recorded it on her phone, capturing the moment when security informed him about the protection order and his mask slipped, his face contorting with rage as he snarled that I'd pay for humiliating him, that no one treated the Rosenbergs this way and survived unscathed. The video was in Richard's hands within an hour and in the district attorney's office shortly after that, another nail in the coffin of Daniel's claim that he was the reasonable party in this situation. That evening, as I sat in Caroline's living room reviewing the mountain of legal documents that had accumulated over the week, I received a call from an unknown California number. My heart raced as I realized it might be Catherine, Daniel's first wife, reaching out after Rebecca had likely told her about our meeting. Her voice was warm but cautious, shaped by years of hard-won healing and careful boundaries. She didn't waste time on pleasantries, understanding that I needed practical information more than sympathy, though she offered both in measured doses. The first thing you need to understand, she said, her words careful and deliberate, is that they will escalate before they surrender. When legal means fail, they'll try financial pressure. When that fails, they'll attack your reputation. When that fails, they'll try to break you psychologically. I went through all of it and it nearly destroyed me. She told me about the private investigators they'd hired to follow her, the rumors they'd spread about her mental health that had nearly cost her her medical license, the way they'd turned mutual friends against her with carefully crafted lies. But she'd survived it all, rebuilt her career, found love again with someone who understood her trauma, and created a life that was entirely her own. The key, she said, is documentation and support. Document everything, no matter how small. Build a support network of people who can't be bought or intimidated. And most importantly, don't let them make you doubt your own reality. They're masters at gaslighting, at making you question whether you're overreacting, whether you're the problem. You're not. You never were. We talked for over an hour, and by the end, I felt less alone than I had since this ordeal began. Catherine gave me her direct number, telling me to call any time, day or night, if I needed someone who understood what I was facing. The Sisterhood of Rosenberg Survivors, she called it with dark humor. A club no one wanted to join but whose members understood each other in ways no one else could. Monday morning of the second week brought the first major legal victory. Marina and Joel's request for bail reduction had been denied, the judge agreeing with the prosecutor that they posed a flight risk given the family's resources and connections. They would remain in custody until trial, unable to coordinate with the family or intimidate witnesses. The photographs of them in orange jumpsuits, processed like common criminals despite their protests about their social standing, had already made the rounds on social media. But Daniel and Sylvia were still free, still fighting, and their tactics were becoming increasingly desperate. A whisper campaign had begun among the hospital board members about my mental fitness to perform surgery. Anonymous complaints filed about my emotional stability. Richard was fighting each attack as it came, but it was exhausting. This constant need to defend myself against lies wrapped in concern for patient safety. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of Marina's society friends, Elizabeth Harrington, contacted Richard with information that changed everything. She had been at the party that night, had seen what happened, and more importantly, had overheard Marina and Joel discussing their plan earlier in the evening. But it was what she revealed about the broader pattern that truly shocked me. According to Elizabeth, this wasn't the first time the Rosenbergs had conspired to imprison someone who challenged them. There had been an incident 5 years ago with a business partner of Daniel's who had threatened to expose some questionable dealings. That man had been held against his will in a warehouse for 2 days before agreeing to sign away his rights to the company. The family had covered it up, paid him off, but Elizabeth had kept records, sensing that one day the information might be valuable. She was willing to testify to provide her documentation, but she wanted protection. The Rosenbergs had already begun threatening anyone who showed support for me, and Elizabeth had received anonymous calls warning her to mind her own business. Richard immediately arranged for her to meet with the FBI, who had begun their own investigation into the family's business dealings based on what the local investigation had uncovered. The scope of what we were uncovering was staggering. This wasn't just a dysfunctional family with boundary issues. It was a criminal organization masquerading as a respectable, wealthy family. Each revelation brought new agencies into the investigation, from the IRS examining their tax records to the state attorney general looking into charity fraud. Tuesday's development was the most personally satisfying. The hospital board, after reviewing the evidence Richard had provided and consulting with their legal team, not only rejected the complaints against me, but issued a public statement of support. They announced that I would be honored at their annual gala for my contributions to pediatric surgery and my courage in standing up to domestic abuse. The same social circles that the Rosenbergs had dominated for years were beginning to turn against them, the tide of public opinion shifting as more stories emerged. Daniel's response was predictable but poorly executed. He held a press conference outside his office building, attempting to paint himself as the victim of a vindictive wife and overzealous prosecutors. But he hadn't counted on the journalists being prepared with hard questions about the security footage, about the pattern of abuse Catherine had documented, about the business partner who'd been imprisoned in the warehouse. Watching him stammer and deflect, his polished facade cracking under pressure, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. This was the man I'd once loved, or thought I loved, reduced to desperate lies in front of cameras that captured every nervous twitch and defensive gesture. Sylvia stood behind him, her face a mask of fury poorly disguised as maternal concern, occasionally whispering in his ear when his answers veered too far from their prepared script. The press conference backfired spectacularly. Within hours, 3 more victims had come forward with stories about the Rosenbergs, emboldened by seeing others stand up to them. A former household employee described years of abuse and wage theft. A neighbor from their previous home detailed harassment that had driven them to move. A young woman who'd briefly dated Joel revealed threats and stalking that she'd been too afraid to report at the time. By Wednesday, the investigation had expanded beyond anything we'd initially imagined. Federal agents had raided Daniel's office, carrying out boxes of documents and hard drives. Sylvia's charity had been frozen pending investigation. Properties were being seized as potential evidence of money laundering. The empire the Rosenbergs had built through decades of crime and cruelty was being systematically dismantled. But even as their world crumbled, they hadn't given up trying to destroy mine. That night, someone leaked medical records from my sessions with Sylvia's therapist years ago, selectively edited to make it seem like I had serious mental health issues. The records were illegally obtained and inadmissible in court, but the damage to my reputation could have been severe if Richard hadn't been prepared. Within hours, he'd released Catherine's full statement about her experience with the same therapist, revealing how the woman had been paid by Sylvia to document anything that could be used against family members who didn't fall in line. The therapist's license was under review by the state board, and her testimony was now worthless as evidence of anything except the family's corruption. Thursday brought an unexpected call from Daniel, somehow made from a borrowed phone at his lawyer's office. His voice was different, stripped of its usual confidence and manipulation, sounding genuinely broken for the first time since I'd known him. "I need you to know something," he said, words slurring slightly as if he'd been drinking. "I did love you once before they got into my head. Before I let them convince me that love was weakness and control was strength. I know it doesn't matter now, but I wanted you to know that it wasn't all a lie." The admission should have meant something to me, should have provided some closure or validation, but all I felt was empty sadness for the man he might have been if he'd been strong enough to resist his family's poison. I didn't respond, just listened as he rambled about chances lost and choices he couldn't take back, until his lawyer took the phone and apologized for the unauthorized call. Richard was furious about the contact, another violation to add to the pile, but I told him not to pursue it. Daniel was finished, his business destroyed, his family facing prison, his reputation in ruins. Adding another charge to the mountain he was already facing seemed like cruelty for cruelty's sake, and I refused to become the monster they tried to paint me as. Friday marked exactly 2 weeks since I'd been locked in that basement, and the transformation in my life was complete. I was back in my own home, protected by state-of-the-art security and the knowledge that those who tormented me were facing justice. The divorce papers had been fast-tracked given the criminal circumstances, and I would be free of the Rosenberg name within the month. More importantly, I had discovered a strength I hadn't known existed within me. The woman who had tolerated years of abuse, who had made excuses for inexcusable behavior, who had prioritized keeping peace over keeping herself safe, that woman was gone. In her place stood someone who understood her worth, who set boundaries and enforced them, who refused to accept treatment she didn't deserve. The support from my colleagues and true friends had been overwhelming. Cards and flowers filled my home. Not with pity but with admiration for standing up to people everyone had known were toxic but no one had dared confront. Several other women in similar situations had reached out, asking for advice, for resources, for hope that they too could escape their gilded cages. Saturday afternoon I sat in my garden, the one space the Rosenbergs had never managed to taint with their presence, reading through the victim impact statement I would deliver at Marina and Joel's sentencing hearing. Richard had helped me craft it, ensuring it was legally appropriate while still conveying the full impact of their actions, not just on that night but throughout the years of systematic abuse. As I practiced reading it aloud, my voice growing stronger with each repetition, Caroline appeared at the garden gate with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. She'd been my rock through all of this, never wavering in her support, never suggesting I should have handled things differently. We sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, a peaceful moment in what had been weeks of chaos. "You know what the ironic thing is?" I said, surprising myself by speaking the thought aloud. "If they'd just been normal, if they'd just treated me with basic human respect, I would have given them everything. I would have shared my success, my resources, my love. But they had to try to own me, to control me, to break me. And in doing so they lost everything." Caroline nodded thoughtfully, sipping her wine before responding. "Some people can't accept gifts freely given. They can only value what they've taken by force. It's a fundamental character flaw that no amount of money or status can fix." The truth of her words settled over me like a blanket, warm and comforting. The Rosenbergs hadn't just lost the legal battles in criminal cases. They'd lost the chance to have genuine relationships, to be truly loved rather than feared, to build something meaningful rather than merely powerful. In trying to imprison me, they'd revealed the prisons of their own making, bars forged from greed and cruelty that no lawyer could ever argue away. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I raised my glass in a silent toast to Catherine, wherever she was in California, living her best life despite what they'd tried to do to her. To Christopher, who'd finally found the courage to leave Marina. To all the victims who'd come forward, breaking years of silence to ensure justice was served. And to myself for surviving, for fighting, for refusing to let them win. The legal battles would continue for months, maybe years. There would be trials and testimony, appeals and negotiations, media coverage and public scrutiny. But I was ready for all of it, armed with truth and supported by people who actually cared about my well-being, rather than what they could extract from me. The Rosenbergs had locked me in a basement for 3 hours, thinking they were teaching me a lesson about power and control. Instead, they taught me the most valuable lesson of my life, that I was stronger than any prison they could build, and that freedom, real freedom, came not from their approval but from my own refusal to ever be caged again. The preliminary hearing was set for a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after my imprisonment, and the courthouse steps were crowded with media and curious onlookers when I arrived with Richard and my security detail. Marina and Joel would be appearing in person, transported from the county jail where they'd been held since their bail was denied. Daniel and Sylvia would be there too, not as defendants in this particular hearing, but as family members desperately trying to salvage something from the wreckage of their empire. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. I sat behind the prosecutor's table, my hands folded calmly in my lap, though my heart raced with anticipation. Across the aisle, the Rosenberg family had assembled their own small army of lawyers and supporters, though notably fewer than might have appeared just a month ago. Their social circle had largely abandoned them as the extent of their crimes became public. Marina entered first, her orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the designer clothes she'd always used as armor. The weeks in jail had stripped away her carefully maintained facade, revealing someone smaller and more fragile than the woman who'd tormented me for years. Her eyes, when they briefly met mine, held a mixture of hatred and something that might have been fear. Joel followed, his usual swagger replaced by a shuffle, his head down as if he could avoid the photographer's lenses through sheer will. Judge Harrison, a woman known for her no-nonsense approach to criminal proceedings, reviewed the charges with methodical precision. False imprisonment, criminal trespass, theft, conspiracy, and now additional charges of witness tampering, based on the threats that had been made to Elizabeth Harrington and others who'd come forward. As each charge was read, I watched Sylvia's face contort with increasing rage, her carefully Botoxed features struggling to express the depth of her indignation. When Marina's lawyer, a slick man named Preston Whitmore who defended numerous wealthy criminals, stood to argue for reduced charges, claiming the incident was merely a family disagreement that had gotten out of hand, Prosecutor Patricia Hernandez was ready with a devastating response. She played the security footage on the courtroom's large screen, every moment of my imprisonment captured in high definition. The casual cruelty of it, the deliberate nature of their actions, the celebration that had continued while I was trapped, all of it played out for the judge and gallery to see. But it was the audio that proved most damaging. The prosecution had enhanced the sound from the videos, isolating conversations where Marina and Joel explicitly discussed their plan, their intention to break me, their belief that I needed to learn my place in the family hierarchy. When Marina's voice rang out clearly saying, "Let her rot down there until she understands who really owns this house," several people in the gallery gasped. Daniel's reaction was perhaps the most telling. As the evidence mounted, as the reality of what his siblings had done became undeniable, he seemed to physically shrink in his seat. The man who'd once dominated boardrooms and commanded respect through sheer force of personality now looked like a lost child, unable to reconcile the family he'd believed in with the criminals being revealed in court. When it came time for victim impact statements, I stood on legs that felt surprisingly steady. The statement I prepared was precise and factual, detailing not just the night of imprisonment, but the years of escalating abuse that had preceded it. I spoke about valuable items destroyed or stolen, about boundaries repeatedly violated, about the systematic attempt to break down my sense of self and reality. I kept my voice level, professional, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me emotional. The defendants, I concluded, looking directly at Marina and Joel, believed that wealth and family connections placed them above the law and above basic human decency. They treated me not as a family member or even as a human being deserving of respect, but as an object to be controlled, punished, and discarded when convenient. The trauma of being locked in my own basement while they partied in my home above me is something I will carry forever, but it will not define me. What will define me is standing here today, ensuring that they face justice for their actions. The judge's decision was swift and decisive. Marina and Joel would stand trial on all charges, with trial dates set for the following month. Bail remained denied despite Preston Whitmore's passionate arguments about their community ties and lack of flight risk. As the defendants were led away, Marina turned back to look at me one more time, and in her eyes, I saw the dawning realization that her actions had finally caught up with her. Outside the courthouse, Daniel attempted to approach me despite the protection order, stopped only by my security stepping between us. His words, shouted across the distance, were captured by every microphone present. "This didn't have to happen, Victoria. We could have handled this as a family. You've destroyed everything." Richard's response, delivered in a voice loud enough for the media to hear, was perfect. "Mr. Rosenberg, your family destroyed everything when they chose to commit crimes. Mrs. Chun simply refused to be a silent victim. If you have anything further to say, you can communicate through your attorney." The media frenzy that followed the hearing was intense. The story had everything the public loved: wealth, scandal, family drama, and a victim who'd fought back. Interview requests poured in from major news outlets, true crime podcasts, and documentary filmmakers. Richard fielded them all, accepting only those that would help build public pressure for justice while protecting my privacy and dignity. But while the legal system ground forward, the personal aftermath was more complex. The house, my sanctuary turned prison, felt different now. Even with the new security systems and the knowledge that Marina and Joel were behind bars awaiting trial, I found myself checking locks obsessively, startling at unexpected sounds, unable to fully relax in spaces where violations had occurred. Caroline suggested therapy, and I knew she was right, but finding time between work and legal proceedings felt impossible. It was Dr. Sarah Brennan, a trauma specialist recommended by Catherine, who finally helped me understand what I was experiencing. "You're not just recovering from one night of imprisonment," she explained during our first session. "You're processing years of psychological abuse that culminated in physical detention. Your body and mind are finally acknowledging trauma that you've been suppressing in order to survive." The sessions were difficult, forcing me to confront not just what the Rosenbergs had done but my own patterns that had allowed it to continue for so long. My need to be accepted, to have the family I'd never had made me vulnerable to their manipulation. My professional success had made me a target for their financial exploitation. My isolation after the first marriage had left me without the support network that might have recognized the abuse earlier. Meanwhile, the investigation into the Rosenberg empire continued to expand. Federal agents had uncovered a web of financial crimes stretching back decades. Shell companies hiding assets, charitable foundations used for money laundering, business deals built on extortion and fraud. Daniel's real estate empire, it turned out, had been built partially on properties acquired through intimidation and illegal tactics. One particularly shocking revelation came from a former employee of Daniel's company, who'd been afraid to speak up until now. Thomas Chun, no relation despite the shared surname, revealed that Daniel had a practice of targeting vulnerable property owners, usually elderly or financially distressed, and using various forms of pressure to force sales at below market prices. When legal pressure didn't work, he would escalate to harassment, and in at least 3 cases to tactics that bordered on physical intimidation. The story Thomas told about Mrs. Eleanor Morrison, an 80-year-old widow who'd owned a valuable piece of commercial property, was especially chilling. Daniel had wanted her land for a development project, but she'd refused to sell, wanting to preserve it for her grandchildren. What followed was a campaign of terror. Mysterious damages to her property requiring expensive repairs, health department complaints about non-existent violations, and finally, a suspicious fire that had forced her to sell just to cover the costs of rebuilding her life. When I heard about Eleanor Morrison, something shifted inside me. My trauma was real and valid, but I had resources, education, and now a legal team fighting for me. How many victims of the Rosenbergs didn't have those advantages? How many had suffered in silence, too afraid or too powerless to fight back? I made the decision to establish a fund for Rosenberg victims, using my own money to provide legal assistance to those who couldn't afford it. Richard initially worried this might be seen as trying to influence the trial, but Judge Harrison actually commended the initiative, noting that it showed a commitment to justice beyond just personal vindication. The fund's first beneficiary was Eleanor Morrison herself, now living in a modest apartment after losing everything to Daniel's scheme. When I met her in person, the dignity and grace she maintained despite what she'd endured was humbling. She held my hands in her weathered ones and said simply, "Thank you for being the one to finally stop them." As the criminal trial date approached, the resistance from the Rosenberg camp intensified. Unable to attack me directly due to the protection orders, they went after anyone associated with me. My colleagues at the hospital began receiving anonymous letters suggesting I was unstable. Parents of my patients were contacted with false concerns about my ability to perform surgery. Even Caroline faced harassment, with Child Protective Services showing up at her door following an anonymous tip about neglect that was quickly dismissed as baseless. Each attack was documented, added to the growing pile of evidence showing a pattern of criminal harassment. But the psychological toll was real. Knowing that every person in my life might be targeted simply for supporting me was a heavy burden. Some acquaintances did distance themselves, not wanting to be caught in the crossfire. But my true friends, the ones who mattered, stood firm. The medical community's response was particularly powerful. Over 200 doctors and nurses signed a public letter of support, praising my surgical skills and professionalism, while condemning the campaign of harassment against me. The hospital board went further, announcing that any attempts to interfere with their staff would be met with immediate legal action. Dr. James Mitchell, the chief of surgery and someone I'd considered a mentor, personally called each concerned patient family to reassure them of my competence and stability. 3 weeks before the trial, Sylvia made a critical mistake. Despite multiple warnings from law enforcement and her own lawyers, she attempted to contact me directly, showing up at the hospital during my shift. Security prevented her from reaching the surgical floor, but not before she created a scene in the main lobby, screaming about ungrateful daughters-in-law and family betrayal, claiming I'd seduced her son for his money and was now destroying the family out of greed. The irony of being accused of gold digging by a woman whose family had systematically stolen from me would have been laughable if it weren't so infuriating. But her public breakdown, captured on multiple cell phone cameras and the hospital's security system, proved to be the final nail in the Rosenberg family's public relations coffin. The video went viral within hours, the hashtag Rosenberg meltdown trending, as people shared their shock at Sylvia's unhinged behavior. Patricia Hernandez wasted no time in filing additional charges against Sylvia for violating the protection order and harassment. This time, bail was set at a level that even the Rosenbergs' resources would struggle to meet, and Sylvia found herself spending 3 nights in jail before her lawyers could arrange payment. The photographs of her being led away in handcuffs, her designer outfit wrinkled and her perfect hair mussed, became the defining images of the family's fall from grace. But it was Daniel's response to his mother's arrest that surprised everyone. Instead of rallying to her defense as expected, he publicly distanced himself from her actions. Through his lawyer, he issued a statement acknowledging that his family's behavior had been inappropriate and criminal, accepting responsibility for enabling their actions through his silence, and announcing that he would be cooperating fully with authorities in their investigation. The betrayal, as Sylvia saw it, of her son choosing legal compliance over family loyalty, sent shockwaves through what remained of their social circle. Jeffrey Rosenberg, Daniel's father who'd been notably absent throughout most of the drama, finally emerged from wherever he'd been hiding to file for divorce from Sylvia, citing irreconcilable differences and seeking to protect what remained of his personal assets from the legal storm. The family that had once presented such a united front against anyone who challenged them was now turning on each other with the same viciousness they'd previously reserved for outsiders. Marina and Joel began blaming each other for the imprisonment plan, each claiming the other had initiated it. Sylvia blamed Daniel for marrying me in the first place. Jeffrey blamed Sylvia for raising criminals. It was a circular firing squad of recrimination and betrayal. In the midst of this chaos, I received an unexpected visitor at my office. Rachel Rosenberg, Daniel's younger cousin whom I'd only met a few times at family gatherings, requested a meeting through Richard. She was different from the rest of the family, having distanced herself years ago to pursue a career in social work, specifically helping victims of domestic abuse. The irony of her career choice given her family's behavior was not lost on either of us. "I've watched from afar for years," she said, sitting across from me in my office, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. "I knew what they were capable of, had experienced it myself when I refused to follow the family blueprint for success. But I was young, powerless, and eventually just ran rather than fighting." She went on to describe her own experiences with the family's manipulation and control, the pressure to conform, the punishment for independence. She'd been written out of wills, excluded from gatherings, and subjected to whisper campaigns that had nearly derailed her career before she'd moved across the country to escape their influence. "What you've done," she continued, Standing up to them with the whole world watching, it's given courage to every person they've ever hurt. You've shown that they're not invincible, that their money and connections can't protect them from consequences forever. Rachel offered to testify about the family's patterns of behavior, to provide historical context that would help establish this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a decades-long pattern of abuse. Her testimony would be particularly valuable because she had nothing to gain from it, having already separated herself from the family and their money years ago. As she left my office, she paused at the door and said something that stayed with me. The saddest part is that they could have been a real family. They had all the resources, all the opportunities to build something beautiful together. Instead, they chose to build a prison of their own making, and now they're finally locked inside it themselves. The metaphor was apartment. While Marina and Joel sat in literal jail cells, the rest of the family was imprisoned by their own choices. Their social standing destroyed, their business empire crumbling, their relationships with each other poisoned beyond repair. They had created a toxic ecosystem that had finally collapsed in on itself, and I had simply been the catalyst that triggered the inevitable implosion. 2 weeks before the trial, Christopher, Marina's soon-to-be ex-husband, provided the prosecution with a treasure trove of evidence. Years of recordings, documents, and correspondence that painted a detailed picture of the Rosenberg family's criminal activities. Most damning was a recording from 2 years ago where Marina, Sylvia, and Joel discuss what they called the Catherine treatment, and how to apply it to me if I ever got too independent. The recording made it clear that what they'd done to Daniel's first wife had been deliberate, coordinated, and successful enough that they felt confident using the same playbook again. They discussed gaslighting techniques, ways to isolate me from potential support systems, and even mentioned the basement as a possible timeout space, if I needed to be taught a serious lesson. The premeditation evident in the recording upgraded some of the charges from simple false imprisonment to conspiracy to commit kidnapping, a federal crime with much more serious penalties. When Patricia Hernandez played the recording for me in preparation for trial, I felt physically sick. For 2 years while I'd been trying to make my marriage work, trying to find my place in the family, they'd been planning my psychological destruction. Every family dinner, every holiday gathering, every seemingly pleasant interaction had been occurring alongside secret discussions about how to break me. Dr. Brennan helped me process this revelation in our sessions. Knowing it was premeditated doesn't make you foolish for not seeing it, she assured me. It makes them particularly cruel and calculating. No one expects their family to be plotting against them. The fact that you survived their campaign and found the strength to fight back is remarkable. The weekend before the trial was set to begin, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I returned to work full-time at the hospital, performing a complex surgery on a 7-year-old with a rare spinal tumor. The normalcy of being in the operating room, of focusing entirely on saving a child's life, provided a respite from the legal drama that had consumed my existence. As I successfully removed the tumor, working with the precision and focus that had defined my career, I realized that the Rosenbergs had failed in their ultimate goal. They had tried to break me, to reduce me to nothing more than a possession to be controlled. But here I was saving lives, surrounded by colleagues who respected me, doing work that mattered. They had imprisoned my body for 3 hours, but they had never touched the core of who I was. The child's parents, when I told them the surgery had been successful, cried with relief and gratitude. They had no idea about the drama in my personal life, didn't care about the Rosenberg trial or the media coverage. To them, I was simply the doctor who had saved their daughter, and in that moment that was all I needed to be. That evening, alone in my house for the first time in weeks without security present, I walked through each room slowly, reclaiming the space. In the living room where Marina had held court at her party, I rearranged the furniture to my liking. In the kitchen where they'd locked me in the basement, I cooked a meal just for myself, using recipes my grandmother had taught me that I hadn't made in years. In the basement itself, I stood where I'd been imprisoned and felt not fear but a strange sense of power. This was where I'd been tested and hadn't broken. This was where their cruelty had overreached and become their downfall. The news came that evening that Joel had agreed to a plea deal, testifying against Marina and the rest of the family in exchange for a reduced sentence. The betrayal within the betrayal was perfect in its irony. The family that had demanded absolute loyalty above all else, that had punished any perceived disloyalty with vicious retribution, was now watching as each member scrambled to save themselves at the other's expense. Marina's reaction, according to Patricia Hernandez, was volcanic. She'd screamed about family loyalty, about blood being thicker than water, about the betrayal of everything the Rosenbergs stood for. The guards reported she'd spent hours raging in her cell, alternating between threats against Joel and desperate pleas for her mother to fix everything the way she always had. But Sylvia was fighting her own battles, her lawyers struggling to separate her from the conspiracy charges, to paint her as merely a bystander to her children's crimes. The strategy might have worked if not for the mountain of evidence showing her active participation in planning and encouraging the abuse. The text messages where she'd called me ungrateful and suggested I needed to be put in my place. The voicemails where she discussed with Marina how to break my spirit. The financial records showing she'd been siphoning money from joint accounts I'd shared with Daniel. Technically another form of theft. The media coverage intensified as the trial approached. True crime podcasts dissected every aspect of the case. Cable news shows brought in experts to discuss the psychology of wealthy family dynamics and abuse. Social media was divided between those who thought I was brave for standing up to them, and those who thought I should have handled it privately, though the latter group grew smaller as more evidence of the Rosenbergs' crimes became public. Richard managed the media brilliantly, ensuring that the focus remained on the crimes committed, rather than allowing the Rosenbergs to shift the narrative to family drama or domestic disputes. Every attempt they made to minimize their actions was met with clear, documented evidence of criminality. Every claim that this was a private matter was countered with the reminder that false imprisonment and conspiracy were crimes against the state, not just personal offenses. 3 days before the trial was set to begin, Daniel made one last attempt at reconciliation, not with me but with his family. He visited Marina in jail, a meeting that was recorded as all jail visits are. The conversation, which became part of the trial evidence, was revealing in its demonstration of how deeply the family dysfunction ran. Daniel pleaded with Marina to take responsibility, to show remorse, to give the court any reason to be lenient. Marina's response was to blame him for everything, for bringing me into the family, for not controlling me better, for failing to protect the family from consequences. She showed no understanding that what she'd done was wrong, only anger that she was being punished for it. When Daniel left the jail, witnesses reported he was crying, the first time anyone had seen him show genuine emotion throughout the ordeal. The night before the trial I couldn't sleep. I stood at my bedroom window looking out at the peaceful suburban street, and thought about how different my life had become. 6 weeks ago I'd been trapped in a dysfunctional marriage, slowly being suffocated by a toxic family, accepting treatment I never should have tolerated. Now I was free in ways I hadn't even realized I'd been imprisoned. The irony was perfect in its completeness. They had locked me in a basement to teach me my place, to show me who had the power, to break my spirit and force my compliance. Instead, that 3 hours of imprisonment had been my liberation. It had provided the evidence, the catalyst, and the clarity I'd needed to finally fight back. Their greatest act of cruelty had become their greatest mistake. As dawn broke on the day of the trial, I dressed carefully in a simple black suit, professional and understated. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw not a victim but a survivor. The Rosenbergs had tried to erase me, to reduce me to nothing more than an extension of their will. They had failed. I was still here, still standing, still fighting. And in a few hours, I would face them in court not as the woman they had tried to break but as the woman who had broken their empire simply by refusing to accept the unacceptable. The trial would be their final performance, their last chance to avoid the consequences they'd spent their lives believing would never touch them. But the outcome was almost irrelevant to me now. I had already won the only victory that truly mattered. I had reclaimed myself, my dignity, my freedom. The rest was just justice taking its course, the slow but inevitable grinding of legal wheels that would finally hold them accountable for crimes they'd never imagined would be exposed to the light. The trial began on a cold March morning with the kind of dramatic atmosphere that courthouse staff said they hadn't seen in years. Marina entered the courtroom in a conservative suit her lawyer had clearly chosen to soften her image, but nothing could disguise the calculating coldness in her eyes as she scanned the gallery. Joel, having already agreed to testify against his sister, sat separately with his own legal team, his former bravado completely extinguished. Patricia Hernandez opened with a methodical presentation of evidence that left no room for doubt about the premeditated nature of the crimes. The security footage, the recordings Christopher had provided, the testimony from multiple witnesses who'd heard Marina and Joel bragging about their plan, it all painted a picture of deliberate cruelty that shocked even seasoned court observers. When Joel took the stand as the prosecution's star witness, the betrayal was complete. He detailed how Marina had orchestrated everything, from planning the party specifically for when I'd be away to preparing the basement in advance by ensuring the lock worked only from the outside. He admitted his own participation but emphasized Marina's role as the mastermind, describing how she'd convinced him this would finally put me in my place and restore the family's natural order. Marina's face during Joel's testimony was a study in rage barely contained. Her lawyer repeatedly had to whisper warnings to her as she muttered under her breath. Her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles went white. When Joel described how they'd laughed about my pounding on the door, how Marina had turned up the music to drown out my calls for help, several jury members visibly recoiled. My own testimony came on the second day. Patricia had prepared me well, but nothing could fully ready me for sitting in that witness box, facing the woman who'd made my life miserable for years. I spoke clearly and factually about that night, about the terror of being trapped, about the humiliation of being imprisoned in my own home while strangers partied above me. But I also spoke about the years of psychological abuse that had preceded that night, establishing the pattern that made their actions not just criminal but part of a sustained campaign of torment. Marina's lawyer, Preston Whitmore, tried to paint me as oversensitive, as someone who'd misunderstood family teasing and blown it out of proportion. But Patricia was ready with evidence for every claim he made. When he suggested I'd been complicit in family dynamics, she produced emails where I'd explicitly asked for boundaries to be respected. When he implied I'd been mentally unstable, she brought in testimony from colleagues and friends about my stability and professionalism. When he tried to suggest the imprisonment had been brief and harmless, she showed photos of my injured wrists and played audio of my increasingly desperate attempts to escape. The most powerful moment came when Eleanor Morrison took the stand. The elderly woman Daniel had driven from her home spoke with quiet dignity about what the Rosenberg family had taken from her. But then she looked directly at Marina and said, "What you did to Dr. Chan was what your family does to everyone who won't bow to you." The difference is she was strong enough to fight back. She gave the rest of us hope that bullies don't always win. Marina's defense when it came was exactly what we'd expected. She claimed it had been a joke gone wrong, that she'd never intended real harm, that family dynamics were complicated and outsiders couldn't understand. She tried to cry on the stand, but the tears seemed forced, and several jury members exchanged skeptical looks. When Patricia cross-examined her, using Marina's own words from the recordings against her, the facade cracked completely. "You said, and I quote, 'Let her rot down there until she understands who really owns this house.' Does that sound like a joke to you, Ms. Rosenberg?" Marina's response, that I'd been too sensitive to understand family humor, fell flat with the jury. One juror actually shook her head in disgust. The verdict came after just 4 hours of deliberation. Guilty on all counts for Marina. The conspiracy charges alone carried a potential 20-year sentence, and Patricia indicated she'd be seeking the maximum given the lack of remorse and the extensive evidence of premeditation. Joel, having pled guilty and cooperated, received a lighter sentence of 3 years with possibility of parole in 18 months. The relief on his face was palpable, though he'd have to serve his time knowing his sister would be locked away far longer partially due to his testimony. Sylvia's separate trial for financial fraud and conspiracy was set for the following month, but the family matriarch never made it to court. 3 days after Marina's conviction, she suffered what her lawyers called a breakdown, and was hospitalized for psychiatric evaluation. Some said it was a ploy to avoid trial, but the doctors confirmed she'd experienced a genuine psychotic break, unable to reconcile the collapse of the world she'd controlled for so long. Daniel's divorce proceedings moved quickly after the criminal trial concluded. With the evidence of his family's crimes and his failure to protect me from them, his negotiating position was non-existent. The house was mine, along with a settlement that reflected both my contributions to the marriage and damages for what I'd endured. He kept his business, what was left of it after the federal investigations, but the Rosenberg real estate empire was a shadow of its former self. The day the divorce was finalized, Daniel sent one last message through his lawyer. Not an apology exactly, but an acknowledgement that he'd failed as a husband, that he'd chosen his toxic family over his marriage, and that he understood why I'd fought back. It was too little too late, but it provided some small closure to that chapter of my life. 6 months after the trial, I stood in my garden hosting a dinner party for the first time since the imprisonment. Caroline was there, of course, as were several colleagues and new friends I'd made through the victim support group I'd started. Rachel Rosenberg attended, having become an unexpected ally and friend through everything. Even Catherine flew in from California, the two of us having formed a bond that only shared survival could create. As we sat around the table, sharing food and wine and stories that had nothing to do with the Rosenbergs, I realized how much my life had transformed. The house that had been a prison now felt like a home. The isolation the family had imposed had been replaced by genuine connections with people who valued me for who I was, not what they could extract from me. Dr. Brennan had helped me understand that healing wasn't linear, that I'd have bad days where the trauma resurfaced. But she'd also helped me see that surviving and thriving after abuse wasn't just possible, it was my right. The Rosenbergs had tried to erase me, but instead they'd revealed a strength I hadn't known I possessed. The Victim Support Fund had grown beyond what I'd imagined, with donations coming from others who'd escaped abusive situations and wanted to help. We'd provided legal assistance to 17 families who'd been targeted by wealthy abusers, and 3 other cases had resulted in convictions. The Rosenberg case had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked privilege and the importance of holding abusers accountable regardless of their social status. Marina served her time in a federal facility 2 states away, her requests for prison transfers to be closer to family repeatedly denied. I heard through legal channels that she'd initially been difficult, trying to establish the same hierarchies in prison that she'd enjoyed outside. But federal inmates, it turned out, had little patience for entitled socialites who thought they were better than everyone else. The last report suggested she'd learned to keep her head down and her mouth shut, a lesson that had come far too late. Joel was released after serving 14 months, but the world he returned to was vastly different from the one he'd left. The family name was toxic, his former friends wanted nothing to do with him, and his attempts to restart his career were met with closed doors. The last I heard, he was working at a car dealership in another state, living quietly and hopefully learning from his mistakes. Sylvia remained in psychiatric care. Her empire dissolved, her children scattered. Her husband remarried to someone who'd apparently been waiting in the wings for years. The woman who'd orchestrated so much cruelty in the name of family was now alone, her delusions of grandeur replaced by medicated quiet in a facility that cost more per month than most people made in a year. Daniel tried to rebuild his business under a different name, but the internet never forgets. Every potential client who Googled him found the stories, the trial coverage, the testimonies about what his family had done. He eventually sold what remained of his company and moved to Europe, seeking the anonymity that would never be possible in New York. A year after the trial, I met someone new. Dr. Marcus Winters was a pediatric neurologist who joined our hospital from Boston. He knew my story, everyone did, but he was more interested in my research on childhood tumors than my dramatic past. Our first date was coffee between surgeries, discussing a challenging case we were collaborating on. Our second was dinner at a quiet restaurant where we talked about everything except the Rosenbergs. Marcus had his own baggage, a difficult divorce, teenage children who were still adjusting, the usual complications of middle-aged life. But he also had kindness without weakness, strength without domination, and most importantly, healthy boundaries that he respected in others. When I told him I needed to take things slowly, that trust would take time to rebuild, he simply said he understood and that I was worth waiting for. We were married 2 years later in a small ceremony in my garden, the space that had once been violated by Marina's party, now filled with genuine friends and chosen family. Caroline was my matron of honor, Catherine and Rachel among my bridesmaids. Marcus's children, initially wary of their father remarrying, had come to see me not as a replacement for their mother, but as an addition to their support system, someone who understood complicated family dynamics and the importance of respect and boundaries. On our wedding night, as Marcus and I slow danced in the living room where I'd once been mocked and belittled, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. The basement where I'd been imprisoned was now Marcus's workshop where he built model trains with his son. The kitchen where they'd locked me away was where I taught his daughter to make my grandmother's recipes. Every space that had held trauma had been overwritten with new, better memories. The woman who'd been locked in that basement 3 years ago would barely recognize the woman I'd become. Not because I'd changed fundamentally, but because I'd finally been freed to be who I'd always been underneath the survival mechanisms and people-pleasing habits. I was still a surgeon, still dedicated to saving lives, but now I saved my own life too every day, by maintaining boundaries, nurturing real relationships, and never accepting treatment that diminished my worth. Marina would be eligible for parole in 15 years, though her lack of remorse made early release unlikely. Sometimes I wondered if she ever thought about that night, if she ever understood that 3 hours of cruelty had cost her decades of freedom. But mostly I didn't think about her at all. She'd become a footnote in my story, rather than a central character. A cautionary example of what happens when entitlement meets accountability. The Rosenberg name, once synonymous with power and prestige in certain circles, had become a warning. Business schools taught case studies about their fall. Law schools used the trial as an example of how conspiracy charges could bring down entire criminal enterprises. Psychology programs analyzed the family dynamics as a textbook example of narcissistic abuse systems. But for me, the greatest victory wasn't their downfall or even the justice served. It was this. Sitting in my garden on a spring evening, Marcus beside me, his children doing homework at the patio table, Caroline stopping by with cookies she'd baked, living a life that was ordinary in all the best ways. No drama, no fear, no walking on eggshells. Just peace, genuine connection, and the freedom to be fully myself. The basement door no longer locked from the outside. Marcus had reversed the mechanism as one of his first projects when he moved in, a symbolic gesture that meant more than any words could express. Now it could only be locked from within, a panic room rather than a prison. I'd never need to use it that way, but knowing I had control over my own safety and space, provided a comfort that those who've never been imprisoned can't fully understand. 3 years and 7 months after being locked in my own basement, I received a letter forwarded through my lawyer. Marina had written from prison, not exactly apologizing but expressing something that might have been regret if she were capable of such emotion. She wrote about understanding now what it felt like to be locked away, to have no control, to be at the mercy of others' decisions. She didn't ask for forgiveness or early release support, just wanted me to know that she finally understood. I read the letter once, then placed it in the file with all the other documentation from that time. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Marina's understanding, if genuine, had come at the cost of her freedom, her family, and her future. My understanding had come at a different price but had led to liberation rather than incarceration. That night, as I prepared for bed in the home that was truly mine, with a husband who respected me and stepchildren who'd learned to love me, I thought one last time about that night in the basement. 3 hours of imprisonment had seemed eternal while I was living through it. But it had also been the catalyst for everything good that followed. The Rosenbergs had tried to break me by locking me away. Instead, they'd set me free. Looking back now, I wouldn't change what happened. Not because it wasn't traumatic, not because justice made it worthwhile, but because surviving it had shown me exactly how strong I was. Every person who's ever been locked away, literally or figuratively, by those who claim to love them knows this truth. The moment you stop accepting the unacceptable is the moment your real life begins. Mine began in a basement, in the dark, pounding on a locked door. But it flourished in courtrooms where truth was spoken, in therapy sessions where trauma was processed, in new relationships where respect was paramount, and finally, in a life rebuilt on my own terms. The Rosenbergs had given me an unwitting gift with their cruelty. They'd shown me exactly what I would never tolerate again. And in clearly seeing what I wouldn't accept, I'd finally understood what I deserved. Everything they tried to deny me and so much more. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.